This session is being recorded and will be posted for playback. Staying on the line and participating grants First Data all permissions necessary to record and post for playback. Please disconnect now if you do not grant permission. This is Lana Boswell with First Data Sales Transformation, and our topic of the day is interchange. Let's get started. Well, here are our objectives. Whenever I see objectives, what I see here are the things that mainly my bosses care about. Training people care about objectives a lot. It's why we're here. When it comes to my agents and sales reps here at Ignite Payments, what I found is typically the objectives are not as important as the what's in it for me or the with them. So I'm going to spend a little bit more time on that for you. Here's in order what we'll talk about today. We are going to go through the transaction process. We're going to do some definitions. We'll go through some interchange scenarios. We'll give you an opportunity to be the consultant. And we'll do a knowledge check at the end. Here is what I was telling you about, that with them. I like to call it my favorite FM radio station, What's in it for me. We like to think of everything from the agent and sales rep's point of view. Why are you here? Why are you going to spend your precious time that you could be talking with clients on a webinar class? Well, here's why. What I like you to do is to look through these and tell me which ones you're going to find useful in running your business for Ignite Payments. Which ones do you think are going to be the most impactful? And you'll probably have to unmute to do that. I'll go ahead and I'll open up also the ability to annotate.
For me, it's analyzing the merchant statements.
Yeah, analyzing those merchant statements. Let's do this. Let's put a check mark there. We'll see if I can draw a check mark or a little arrow. Analyzing the merchant statements. Here we go. That's one. So that's going to be key. It helps also when you're using the annotation tools if you pick a color that shows up. So I'll go from yellow to red to show that. Also, I think for agents, you're not here to be charitable. So being able to determine profitability, that's another good reason to be here. It will also help you understand Ignite Payments pricing and recommend merchant best practices. So before we go on, I'm going to go through all of the players in the generic transaction process. The reason we do that is because the definition of interchange includes these entities, and we want to make sure that everybody has a clear understanding. I'm working out of a small sales office in Moore Park, California today. There's probably 50 people here, and I could tell you if I went out here and talked to 50 different people here working at and for Ignite Payments and First Data, I'd probably get 30 different definitions of interchange. Before we go on and we do interchange and we show you how that works, then what we want to do is we want to take everybody back to the beginning, get a clear definition of what interchange is, and that's going to involve clarifying who all of the players are. We'll start here with the card holder. That one is pretty easy. Let's call it this gentleman here in the striped shirt. He's the card holder. He's the one passing his card over at the point of sale or the POS. You probably already know there's 1,000,001 acronyms in the business. Then when you add First Data Ignite Payments on top of that, there's another 1,000,002 acronyms. So if I ever use an acronym that you are unfamiliar with, just call me on it and I'll give you a definition. Typically what I'll try to do is I'll try to speak them out so it's a little bit more clear. POS again is point of sale. So we have our card holder there at the point of sale. The other person at the point of sale is our merchant. So we have our merchant and we have our card holder. We know who that is there at the point of sale. Then as transactions are processed, what the merchant is trying to get, the merchant is trying to get an authorization approval for that transaction. That has to run then through the acquirer. The acquirer, I'll give you a big hint here, who's the acquirer in our scenario? Who's the acquirer in our scenario here? And I'll draw the arrow for you there as well. It is First Data. So we know who the card holder is, we know who the merchant is, and now we know who the acquirer is. First Data is the acquirer. First Data has various sales channels out there selling merchant services in their acquisition of merchant transactions. First Data is the acquirer. Other acquirers out there would be, let me give you some other examples, Chase, Heartland, Elavon, Pieces I think is one. So those are our competitors as well. The next one up is card organization. Give me some examples of card organizations. The annotation tools are open. If you want to type those in, you could type those here, just below card organization, or just speak them out. I see one in our chat area. You are exactly right. Well, it helps if you can spell. Visa, V-I-S-A. You would think that would be the easy one to spell. Visa is one of them. And then we can go on from there. MasterCard. And we can keep going. Discover. When it comes to interchange, we're specifically talking about Visa, MasterCard, and Discover. American Express pricing is something that we talk about as a separate topic. In fact, American Express specifically says they do not have interchange. They have what they call American Express program pricing. And for our purposes, who we are going to focus on today is we're going to focus on the top two. The top two, of course, are going to be Visa and MasterCard. Now, in the case of Visa and MasterCard, it's not Visa and MasterCard that issue those cards. Who issues the cards? Who are the ones putting those cards in the hands of the card holders? Oh, excellent, and I see an example there. So we have Bank of America, and I see also Wells Fargo coming in on chat. So banks issue credit cards. Now, one of these I have in my own wallet. I have Wells Fargo card in my wallet. I also have a Visa card from Ventura County Credit Union. And I'll use my wallet as an example going forward, so I just wanted to mention that too. Now, depending in your area, there may be 5, 10, 20 other banks. Maybe you see Chase. Maybe you see PNC. Maybe you see Citi. Banks issue MasterCard and Visa. So now that we know who everybody is, we know who the card holder is, the merchant is, the acquirer, we know who the card organizations are. I'm going to clear this up and let's talk about the transaction process. At that point of sale, when the merchant requests the authorization, they will either get back an approval or decline. How long does that process take? Well, you saw my arrows populate up here as the arrows are populated, sometimes it takes that long, sometimes it takes less, sometimes it takes a little bit more, but it is really, really fast. The request for authorization from the point of sale, here between the card holder and the merchant, goes out to the acquirer, to the card organization, to the issuer, and the answer comes back, in this case to that tabletop terminal on the counter, that approval, and then the card holder is on his way with the merchandise. So really fast process these days. Now let's look at the definition of interchange. Looking at the definition of interchange, here we go. Interchange is the transfer rate exchanged between the acquirer and the issuer each time a card organization branded card is used. So who's the acquirer? Well, that's First Data. And who's the issuer? The issuer are the banks. So now we know that interchange is how much First Data, the acquirer, pays to the issuing bank when a card organization branded card is used. So if the card presented has the Visa logo, it's how much First Data pays back to the bank that issued that Visa card. If it has a MasterCard logo, it's how much First Data pays to the bank who issued that MasterCard. So this is really, really important when we're talking about interchange. We are going to be 100% focused on the wholesale cost of transaction processing. We're not talking about what merchants pay. We will talk about what merchants pay, but we talk about that in a separate class that we call pricing. So today we're strictly talking about interchange, and as you can see by the definition here, interchange is how much First Data pays back to the issuing bank. Now I mentioned some of our competitors out there. Interchange is public information. It is MasterCard and Visa that sets those rates. It's public information. So the wholesale cost, whether the acquirer is First Data or Chase or Heartland or whoever, the wholesale cost, the interchange cost, is always the same. Let me clear this up, and I have some more information to populate on the slide for you. Now, it is the card organizations, MasterCard and Visa, who establish those interchange rates, and they typically make updates it is seasonal, and it's twice a year, so that's going to be every spring and fall. Every spring and fall, they update interchange rates. Now, sometimes interchange rates go up, sometimes they go down, sometimes they add new ones. It just depends on what's happening in our industry. If you think back 20, 25 years ago, there was no e-commerce, meaning on interchange there was no consideration for e-commerce. So as the way we did business changed, and as e-commerce came to be a thing, then interchange had to change to accommodate that. So every spring and fall, the card organizations, MasterCard, Visa, Discover, they establish those interchange rates and fees, and they make updates. Now, there are typically two components to interchange: how this transfer rate is calculated. The transfer rate is typically calculated in two ways. The first way is a percentage of the transaction total, and then the second way is a per item transaction fee. A percentage of the transaction total plus a per item transaction fee. Here's an example of interchange. Now, as we look at the example here of interchange, we see that it says 180 and 10 cents. Well, actually what it says is 1.80% and 10 cents. But, of course, in our industry, that's way too much to say. When you hear somebody talk about this interchange, you're going to hear 180 and 10. When the interchange on a $100 transaction then is $180.10, here's how we calculate out the cost. We have our $100 times 1.80%. If you have a percent key on your calculator, great. If not, you can convert that into a decimal by moving the decimal over 2 points. Have to remember back to school and math for all that, though. Then we have that equaling $1.80. Then we add on the 10 cents, and then that gives us a total of $1.90 when the interchange is $180.10. I'll pause for a moment there to see if you have any questions. And while I'm pausing, we're going to do one of our own. Let's change that ticket size. Let's change that ticket size to be $10 and see how that affects the cost. Not seeing any questions in the chat or hearing anything, so let's calculate out a $10 transaction. So here we have $10. $10 is the transaction, and we still have times 1.80%, and that's going to give us how much? So $10 times 1.80% is going to be Yep, 18 cents. Then we have to add on 10 cents for the per item fee for a total cost of 28 cents. Let me draw in some lines for you there. So here's where our lines are. And you can see the calculation of a $10 transaction versus a $100 transaction. So a $10 transaction when the interchange is $180.10 is going to cost 28 cents, and a $100 transaction for the same interchange would be $1.90. So it's as simple as that. Let's go forward. Well, your next question then might be, how do I know if the interchange is 180.10 or 0.80 and 15? How is that determined? Well, that's determined by something that they call interchange levels. Now, what an interchange level is a group of transaction requirements and limitations identified by the card organization and assigned a name as well as a specific transaction fee and or percentage. What I like to think of when I think of interchanges, I like to think about the world's biggest coin sorter. So picture a coin sorter. What happens? You take a big old bag of coins and you throw it into the coin sorter, and something happens, maybe it shakes around, and all of the pennies go into the penny slot, and all of the quarters go into the quarter slot. All the nickels go into the nickel, dimes, etc. Because quarter can't be in the penny slot because that's for pennies. A penny can't be in a quarter slot because that's for quarters. Same thing with interchange. Based on a whole bunch of characteristics, when a transaction comes in, and each and every transaction does come in, it's determined, whether that transaction is a penny, a dime, or a nickel. And that group of transaction requirements is assigned a name, just like we call the big round silver one a quarter, we might call an interchange level MasterCard Merit 3. Same thing. Now, they put all of this information for us in a document that is called an interchange qualification matrix. I'm going to put this up on the screen for you in just a minute. The interchange qualification matrix then is the document. This is a merchant-facing document. It's provided to merchants as part of full disclosure. It's posted on Business Track, that is the merchant portal, and we provide it for agents. It's posted on My Agent Office, My Office, Applications, ROLA Application Center, Interchange Qualification Matrix. It's important that you note that, because even though I put one in your handouts for you today in file transfer, that's going to be updated come the fall again, and the one you have would be out of date. Let me pause for a moment to see what questions you have. Okay. When it comes to interchange levels, just so you know, interchange levels are sometimes referred to as interchange plans or interchange programs. If you squint really, really hard, you could see that the title of this column says interchange level, but depending on who you talk to and where they came from and what department they're in, they might call an interchange level. They might also call that an interchange plan or program, and it's important to note because many of our agents have experience in the business and might be used to hearing the term called an interchange plan or program rather than an interchange level. Now, before I go and I show you this, I'm not going to make you look at this squinty little bit all the time. I'm going to show you the actual document. I want to give you a couple of common Visa acronyms. Visa has one they call CPS. CPS stands for Custom Payment Services. I'm sure it means something big and really important to Visa. It doesn't mean a lot to us, except that CPS is typically going to be a retail transaction. And then IRF stands for Electronic Interchange Reimbursement Fee. So again, something that I'm sure means an awful lot to Visa, but not much to us in practice. I am going to share my screen with you. I am going to share that interchange qualification matrix so you can see what that looks like. Here's the interchange qualification matrix. I'm going to scroll down. I'm going to come down here to page 3. As I'm looking at page 3 on the interchange qualification matrix, so here's my interchange level. Interchange level is named CPS Retail, and then here are the requirements for it. It has to be a U.S. merchant. The MEG card swipe has to be passed in the authorization request. Applicable electronic authorization, that means an electronic authorization and not a voice authorization, calling in to get an authorization. Say if the MEG Stripe reader or the point of sale terminal didn't work. And then settlement in 1 day, and that means that the merchant needs to close their batch at the end of the day. And then it gives me some exceptions here. Authorization and settlement amounts must match for debit cards, beauty salons, barbers, spas, and so on. Okay, now I want to ask myself here, why would these types of businesses be excluded? What do they all have in common? And you are correct, they all have in common tips. Tips would make the request for authorization a different amount than the final amount once that tip was added on. The next column here is limitations. This says that in order to be a CPS retail transaction, the card has to be a U.S. issued consumer credit, debit, and prepaid card. That means that this is the best a generic retail merchant can do, CPS retail, when a U.S. issued consumer credit card is presented. But as soon as a rewards card is presented, as soon as a purchasing card is presented, as soon as a business card is presented, all of those other different types of credit cards, as soon as those are presented, that transaction would never be a CPS retail transaction because, as we can see here, it specifically says it has to be a U.S. issued consumer credit, debit, or prepaid card. So if it's anything else, it would not be able to be a CPS retail transaction. Then it excludes some business types. Typically on the Visa table, when we're excluding business types, that means that they have their own levels. So there are different levels specifically for fast food, supermarkets, automated fuel dispensers, and retail service stations. And then it's going to exclude travel services. So this is our first look at that interchange qualification matrix. Let's go back to the PowerPoint presentation. Going back to the PowerPoint presentation then, let's give ourselves a couple of more definitions and then we'll do some practice. Now, clearing. Clearing is identifying and assigning an interchange level to individual transactions. We saw our first interchange level was named Visa CPS Retail. So determining whether a transaction is a Visa CPS Retail transaction, that's called clearing. If we're using that giant coin sorter analogy, it's the process by which it's determined, is it a quarter, is it a dime, is it a nickel, is it a Visa CPS Retail, is it a Visa CPS Retail key entry, is it a Visa IRF? Determining where that transaction clears is identifying and assigning an interchange level. Here's a list populating on your screen now. You can see a lot of different criteria goes into determining that, what type of card it is, which card organization, was the transaction swiped or keyed, what's the business type, the matching and timeliness, are the authorization and settlements amounts the same, what's the authorization date versus the batch closure date, and so forth. All of those things go into determining which interchange level the transaction clears at. Another term, we saw that earlier, settlement. Settlement really is moving the money around, paying the entities involved in the transaction process. When you look at the diagram here, typically when we're talking about settlement, we're talking about Ignite Payments First Data getting that money to the merchant. Funding the merchant is known as settlement, but we already know that First Data pays the issuing bank interchange. Now MasterCard, Visa, Discover, they're not in it for nothing. They're in it for a little piece of the pie as well. Their piece of the pie is called dues and assessment. And then ultimately the cardholder settles up with the issuing bank. So settlement is moving the money, paying the entities involved in the transaction process. Now that we know what interchange is, we know what clearing is, and we know what settlement is, we're going to do 4 scenarios for a generic retail merchant. A generic retail merchant, let's say that at the point of sale, we run a consumer card. It's swiped. The authorization and transaction amounts are equal. The authorization, transaction, and settlement dates are the same. When that is the case, Visa is going to call this a CPS retail transaction. We saw that at the top of page 3. And the cost for that transaction for credit would be $151.10. And for non-PIN debit, the cost of that transaction, again, how much First Data pays back to the issuing bank, would be $0.80 and $15. Then we have this little note here in the box for regulated debit. A few years back, the U.S. government decided to get a little bit more involved in the industry, and what they did was they regulated how much big banks can make on debit interchange. How much can a big bank make on debit? Well, think about it. Debit's a pretty low-risk transaction because with a debit transaction, part of the authorization process is making sure the money is there and then holding up the money. So pretty low-risk transaction. Well, what they said was the federal government regulated like this. They said a regulated bank is any bank with more than $10 billion in assets, and that the maximum interchange on any debit transaction at a regulated bank is 0.05% and 22 cents. Using my own wallet as an example then, if I go into a shoe store, because I'm a girl and girls do that, if I go into a shoe store and I present my Ventura County Credit Union Visa debit card, then the interchange on that transaction is 0.80 and 15 cents. Ventura County Credit Union makes 0.80% and 15 cents. But if for the same transaction I were to pull out my Wells Fargo Visa debit card, then Wells Fargo would only make 0.05% and 22 cents. Make sense? Okay. Visa and MasterCard are similar, but not the same. You can see here that MasterCard is going to clear this transaction at something called Merit 3. So not CPS Retail, but something called Merit 3. We'll find the requirements at the top of page 16. The credit rate would be 1.58% and 10, and the non-PIN debit rate would be 1.05 and 15. And then, as always, for regulated debit, it's still 0.05% and 22 cents. Now, another thing in the business here you'll hear us say is, rather than saying 0.05%, they'll also call that 5 basis points. 5 basis points and 22 cents. MasterCard Merit 3. Let me share my desktop with you again. We will go back to the interchange qualification matrix. And let's do this. Okay, just a moment, let me pause this. And the recording is back on. We have a question here. The question comes from Richard. The question is, these rates do not include PIN debit, and that's correct. What we're talking about specifically here is we're talking about credit or debit run as credit. So PIN debit is a separate topic. It's a separate line item on the merchant processing application. And rather than having interchange, the way a PIN debit transaction is charged is by something that we call debit network fees. And then we have a standard $5 per month charge for debit. So these do not include PIN debit. I'm going to go back to sharing my desktop. We are going to go back to the interchange qualification matrix. Back on the interchange qualification matrix, here we are in Merit 3. Now we saw CPS Retail. That was MasterCard's best rate for a generic consumer card. Here's rather Visa's best rate. Here's MasterCard's. So the document actually goes in reverse alphabetical order. So we can see we're down on page 16 now. So still U.S. merchant, still Magstripe Red, still applicable electronic auth data, settlement within 1 day of transaction, 10% authorization tolerance, and then we have restaurants, bars, fast foods, limos, taxi, exempt from the transaction tolerance. So once again, we're eliminating, here's the tolerance for some businesses entirely. As we go over here to the card types area, what we see here on the card types area is we see we still have U.S. issued, but then it's going to exclude some business types and exclude also some type of rewards cards. So similar, but not the same. Okay, let's go forward. Going forward, let's do our next scenario. So in this scenario, what's the difference? In this scenario, the difference is that the transaction is keyed instead of swiped, but we got something new. We got something called AVS. AVS, what's that? I'm looking for that. AVS, you've probably experienced it at the point of sale when you're asked for your zip code. AVS is Address Verification Service. In this case, we did AVS and we got a zip code match, and the transaction and settlement dates are the same. Next up, generic retail merchant. So here's what happened. Visa is going to clear this transaction. They're going to call it a CPS retail key entered. 180 and 10, that was our example from before. And then regulated debit is always the same. How much is the amount for regulated debit, the percentage and the per item fee? If you forgot, we still have it down here at the bottom, 0.05 and 22 cents. There we go. I see it. Perfect. Now, MasterCard would call this transaction a key entered transaction. $1.89 and 10 cents, $1.60 and 15. So MasterCard key and Visa retail. Let's go back here. Let me share my desktop again with you. And let me show you. Let's go back to CPS retail. Now we have key entry. As we look through here, through the requirements for key entry, this time we don't have that magnetic swipe requirement. So because this transaction was keyed instead of swiped, key entered but card present, applicable electronic authorization, settlement with 1 day, and then here we see the AVS response with full zip match. So if the card holder can't come up with the billing zip code, some equipment you're able to program so that the merchant has the ability to request another form of payment, and some equipment, it just takes it and passes it through without the zip match. Then over here, we still have our limitations on card type. So the difference between CPS retail and CPS retail key entry is that key entry is a key enter transaction, and an AVS response with full zip match was obtained. Let's go back to Merit. this time what we're going to look at is we're going to look at the key entered. So this is MasterCard key entered. As we look through MasterCard key entered though, what you'll see is it has to be an electronic authorization, card present, but I don't see anything here about AVS. So now we've come across a difference in philosophy when it comes to MasterCard and Visa. As you look at all of the MasterCard interchange levels, you're not going to see AVS as a requirement. But when you look at the Visa levels, you'll see that AVS, that address verification service, you'll see that serves a requirement. Why a merchant may or may not want to do it has to do with pricing, because separate from interchange pricing are a whole bunch of other rates and fees that our merchants get charged when they have a merchant account with Ignite Payments, and we charge a 5 cents per item for address verification service. Now, when the card is keyed instead of swiped, my recommendation as a business consultant would still be that's a good idea to get the address verification. And then here we have a 10% authorization tolerance, another way that they're different. So MasterCard says I can authorize the transaction for $100, but I could complete the transaction for up to 110 or down to 90, and the transaction could still clear at key entered. But what we saw on the Visa side is for the same scenario, they want the authorization and settlement amounts to match unless the business is exempt or tipped in some way. So that is our second scenario. Our third scenario, now we have it keyed still, but this time there's no AVS. Let's see how the pricing changes. Visa is going to clear this at IRF, and now it costs $230.10 instead of $1.80. So you can see that it gets more expensive when AVS doesn't happen on the Visa side, but for MasterCard, MasterCard clears it the same way. So whether AVS is obtained or not, it's $189 and $10 on the MasterCard side. So MasterCard, I hear people say MasterCard's always more expensive when it comes to interchange. Be careful with those absolute. I could say MasterCard is typically more expensive, but here's a scenario where MasterCard is not more expensive than Visa. If you think about it, MasterCard's number 2, so typically in order to get those banks to issue MasterCards, they're going to have to pay a little bit more. Here's our fourth scenario. Here is something that's not desirable at all. Look at this scenario and tell me where the risk lies. Where is the risk going to lie in this transaction? And you're right, it's going to be right there. When the authorization and transaction dates are not the same, meaning that the transaction is swiped, it sits in that terminal now for 5 days. Once you go over 2 days, MasterCard and Visa both get very, very nervous about that, because what it's doing is it's opening the merchant up for a chargeback. So as a best practice, authorize and settle, set the account up for auto close to make sure that that happens. This is the one case where they actually agree though. MasterCard and Visa both call this a standard transaction. And you can see that Visa standard is 270 and 10. And you can see that MasterCard standard is 295 and 10. I won't take the time to go back and look at that interchange qualification matrix, but the only qualification for standard, I believe, is to close the batch within 30 days. So a very risky transaction, this one is. So think about that. We started out where we swiped, we closed the batch. That was not a lot of money on interchange. Then as the transaction got more and more risky, the transaction became more and more expensive. And each time we did one of our scenarios, that transaction did what we call downgrade. Now I'm going to give you an opportunity to be the consultant. The annotation tools are open. If you're listening to the recording, pause the recording and make a list for yourself. Based on what we've covered so far, what recommendations would you make to retail merchants regarding transaction and batching? Some of the things we've talked about: swipe whenever possible, batch daily, set up auto close whenever practical. For the best rate when keying Visa, use address verification service, AVS, and follow those point of sale prompts. So when the terminal is asking for the zip code, we encourage you to train your merchants to enter the zip code. When the point of sale prompt is asking for the tax amount, put in the tax amount. The programming of the devices is fairly comprehensive and pretty complex. So typically when the point of sale device is asking for information, it's asking for a reason, and many times that reason is to be able to clear that transaction at a more favorable interchange. I talked a bit about auto close. Auto close is going to be practical for your merchants, except those with tips, because they need to clear those tips, have the servers tip out before that batch is closed. So it should definitely be part of their end-of-day procedures, but maybe not set up auto close for a restaurant just because you wouldn't want the batch to close without the tips in it. Excellent. Okay, and I'm looking at the chat. It looks like you got all that as well. I'm going to give you a quick example here. I have a friend who has a furniture store, and from one month to the next, her processing went up a lot. So she called up her local customer service team, and they asked her, is something wrong with your MagStripe reader? And she said, no, in fact, I just ran a transaction this morning. And they said, well, it looks like starting on such and such a date, and they gave her a date, your transactions went from being mostly swiped to being mostly keyed. So she went back, and that date was a big one for her because they had just hired a new cashier who she went back to and who said to her, I thought it was more fun to key. So that tip then is for you to take with your merchants as business consultants. What we encourage you to do is to not only talk to your merchant and make sure they're trained, but go that extra mile to make sure that their cashiers are trained, and then that can separate you out from the competition, demonstrating genuine concern, taking it farther than just helping the merchant, but making sure that their cashiers know what to do as well. We'll wrap this up then with a quick knowledge check. You can use the chat to type in. The annotation tools are open if you just want to mark what you think is the correct one. I'll be looking for your answers. What is interchange? A, B, C, or D? And I have a letter C coming through. You are correct. Interchange is the transfer rate exchanged between the acquirer and the issuer each time a card organization branded card is used. It is how much, in our case, how much First Data pays back to the issuing bank. Now, what is clearing? And let's check again here. Let's see, what is clearing? I have C. Clearing is identifying and assigning an interchange level to individual transactions. Let's eliminate a couple of these then. It can't be B because it doesn't involve paying. It can't be C because, again, it's not paying. And we don't necessarily communicate the interchange rate to the merchant after settlement. So clearing is kind of what we did with our scenarios when we went through scenario 1, 2, 3, and 4. We looked at the characteristics of the transaction, and we saw how the transaction cleared when it came to MasterCard and Visa. But this one, true or false? And it looks like you're exactly right there. That's going to be a big false. Restaurant merchants should not always be set up with auto close, although I have heard of restaurant owners who said, you know, that the servers need to get those in or they don't get the tips. So philosophy there. And how about this one? This is really a what's more expensive. Credit interchange when compared to non-PIN debit interchange is what? And I see you have it there. Now this one here, I don't really like this question a lot myself, because when it comes to the ticket size, we know that the non-PIN debit interchange, when we look at it just on the surface, is typically maybe credit is typically more expensive. But when it comes down to ticket size, and especially if you were happen to be in a non-PIN regulated scenario, if you have a really low ticket and they're paying 22 cents per item, that's going to be much more than the 5 basis points. So for that merchant, it could be more expensive, less expensive, etc. So the question is meant for us to have a conversation. If you pick the incorrect answer, there you go. Like I said, not a lot of absolutes in our business. Good. So I think that takes us to the end of the presentation.